not realize this consciously, but subconsciously you'll probably start to relate to it. But sex is really, really good for you. It's really good for your health. It's really good for your relationship. And it's really good for your happiness and your longevity. So I'm just going to roll through some of my favorite ones. I have this slide in my TEDx talk, and it has about 20, I think it's about 21 to do. Yeah, probably about 20 different benefits of sex. And that slide's backed up by more than 65 scientific research studies. So these are all backed by some kind of research. And I just want to talk about them. I want to start with sleep. So, it's funny when Patty and I were having trouble with our sex life because he always wanted to do it and I never did. One of my go-to excuse wasn't the headache. We'll talk about headaches in a minute, but my go-to excuse was that I'm tired. I'm always tired, especially when the kids were young and I was, we're both working full-time jobs and our household responsibilities and dragging the kids all around. Like by the end of the day, I was spent. And so I would say, "Oh, I'm so tired." So, sleep. He'd say, "Sleep's more important than sex." And I'd be like, "Yes." But you know what? There are studies that show that um, when you have sex, and especially if you orgasm, your body gets flooded with this chemical called prolactin. And prolactin does a lot of things, but one of the things that it does is it makes you sleepy. So if you have sex right before bed, you will fall asleep faster. The research also shows that you will stay asleep longer. And for women, I don't think they've proven this in men, but for women, your REM sleep, you're going to experience more REM sleep, which is the sleep that's the restful bit, the part that where your body heals and it's super restful. So I think if Patty had known that and had said, "Well, baby, if we have sex, you're going to sleep better." I've seen it actually. I've seen a few studies. I haven't read them, but where sex is one of those things they recommend for insomniacs, to try using sex to help people fall asleep and stay asleep longer. So if Patty had said, "Hey, if we have sex, you're going to sleep better, which means you'll wake up more rested," I might have given into that one. It also boosts your immune system. And you probably, again, like the sleep thing, many people already, you can feel that, a lot of times. You get a nice kind of sleepy buzz after you've had an orgasm with your lover. So the immune system also can be improved with sex. There was a research study where they found that people, after they had sex, there's something called immunoglobulin A that they were finding in their saliva in greater amounts, which is part of the immune system, an indicator of how well your immune system is functioning. So it boosts your immunities. There are other studies, but it's a lot of science for a non-scientist like myself to remember all the studies. But anyway, it boosts your immunities, which is awesome. And if you think about sex, some of the benefits are things that you experience, right? Like sex is exercise. Most of us get that. We feel that when we're having sex. And it boosts our mood. Again, you're flooded with all of these feel-good hormones like oxytocin and dopamine. And so that boosts your mood and it lowers stress. And then if you think about that, those three things also lower your blood pressure and your risk for cardiovascular disease, heart disease. So those are also, so the exercise is a benefit, the reduces stress is a huge benefit. Again, they've measured cortisol and cortisol levels before and after sex, as well as its reactivity when you're doing something stressful. So you want your cortisol goes up during stressful events, but then you want it to be reactive in that when you want your cortisol level to go down quickly after the stressful event or whatever is happening, and so that that cortisol doesn't linger. And there was a study that showed that when after people had had some sort of sexual activity, that their cortisol reaction was better than without the sex. So it's pretty cool that they can measure all this fantastic stuff. So it reduces stress, boosts your mood. It's exercise. It does lower blood pressure. There's been a number of studies also about the heart disease health. It's interesting. These studies started out. There's one in Thailand, there was one in the UK, and there's been a couple in the US. But the ones that were done overseas, these studies started out as longevity studies. They were trying to figure out if sex was tied to a longevity because they were gathering large amounts of data over multiple years, like between 10 and 20 years. And they collected all this data and found that the frequency of sex seemed to correlate with a person's lifespan, because the people who were having sex more frequently were living longer, which then led them to figure out, like, why is that happening? And some of it can be explained by the cardiovascular health that these people were experiencing. And again, it's like the cart and the horse, like, which one's the chicken, which one's the egg? Do they have better cardiovascular health, which allows them to have sex more frequently, or is the frequent sex creating the cardiovascular health? Well, there was one study that was published and I'm not sure that there's any conclusive evidence either way, but it's nice to know, or it's good to know that, if you can figure out how to get yourself healthy enough to have sex fairly frequently, that your risk for cardiovascular disease will go down. But there was one study that was published in the American Journal of Cardiology that showed that men who had sex at least twice a week, 2 to 3 times a week, they had a 45% lower risk for cardiovascular disease than men who were having sex once a month or less. So I find that very interesting. And there's been another study that showed that for women, it isn't the frequency. It isn't the frequency of sexual activity that makes a difference, but the quality. So the quality of a woman's sex life is more protective against cardiovascular disease and lowers her blood pressure. So it can't just be sex all the time for women. It has to be good sex, whatever that means for you, satisfying sex. So I thought it's interesting too, like, throughout the years, I think I've mentioned this, they've been doing research on men and just sort of applying that to women. But as it turns out, that doesn't really work. We're pretty different. It's interesting how that shakes out even in this idea of cardiovascular disease risk and blood pressure and sex. There are also studies that show sex boosts your cognition. They have done these tests where some of it's tied to fantasy. When sometimes when we're having sex, we fantasize to create a really exciting experience for ourselves, and how our imaginations are pretty good during and after sex. And they also did some tests in women that showed that they could retain information longer after having sexual intercourse or for having frequent sex. So that's pretty cool. It boosts your confidence. A lot of people probably know that, but that was one of the that's actually one of the when they were studying one night stands and if there were any benefits to those, that was one of the things that came out of it, was that people felt pretty confident after they had a one night stand. Let's see what else is on this list. A newer study came out that showed it improves job satisfaction and performance. And I don't think I read through the entire list, but I mean, it makes sense that if your mood is boosted, if your stress is lowered, if you're feeling confident and you can remember more. I mean, it just, like, you start looking at them and you're like, yeah, they're all interrelated. They all work together to create these very awesome benefits. It also limits pain. Doctors Beverly Whipple and Barry Komisaruk, they have done a lot of studies Well, some with rats and some and but many more with humans. In fact, I think Dr. Kamasurik was the first person to ever see an MRI of a woman's brain when she was having an orgasm. And they've learned a lot about sex and orgasm through those and how the brain interacts with that through these studies. Fascinating stuff, too, about people who have spinal cord cuts can still have orgasms even though they don't really have sensation in those parts of their bodies, but their bodies rewire somehow the those those receptors so that they can still without going through the spine so they can still achieve orgasm. And I think that's pretty cool. So they've been studying that kind of thing. But one of the things that they found is that sex, not specifically sex, but vaginal stimulation and orgasm, they both block pain. It makes sense when you think about the vaginal stimulation because women have babies and that's extremely painful. And it makes sense that the body would have its own natural painkiller to help women get through that. So it makes sense that vaginal stimulation would block pain. And it's nice that orgasm does that as well. So that they've shown that it can block chronic back pain. And my adorable mother, who suffers badly from chronic back pain, I was telling her, "Mom, you know, if you sex and vaginal stimulation, it blocks chronic back pain." And she said, "Yes, I know, dear." So there you go. Not only did they prove it in the labs, but my mom says so too. So it must be true.